Have you ever picked up a book and started reading the last chapter, or perhaps picked up a DVD and wanted to start from near the end to see the final action? It's like watching a James Bond film just as the villain is dispatched in a great fireball and not knowing what adventures have happened beforehand. Or like going to watch Romeo and Juliet as he declares his love for Juliet without understanding the antagonism that has gone on beforehand between the two families. The story of Noah is the story of God's action in response to the culmination of events going back in time, way back to the time of creation. In order to understand why God reacts in the way he does, it's important to see it in the context of what has gone before. So, before we look at Noah, let's look at the first few chapters of Genesis in a nutshell. God created light and dark, sea and sky, heaven and earth, plant life, everything that walks on the land, swims in the sea or flies in the air. He created man and woman in his image, and all was good. Everything was perfect. Everything was equal. Everything was beautiful. Then mankind, Adam and Eve, disobeyed the one rule that God had made, and so the relationship with God was broken. But it wasn't only that relationship, but also the relationship between themselves, between Adam and Eve, that was damaged. From that day on, men were doomed to physical work in order to try and tame the land to produce food. Women were doomed to suffer pains in childbirth and to be ruled over by men. This was not a recipe for harmonious relations. This curse was not just for Adam and Eve, but it continued down the generations. We see in the next generation the expression of jealousy, anger, and even murder. And so that fractured relationship with God and with each other continues down and down the generations, continues in our world even today. We see anger and jealousy. We see greed and hunger. We see violence and suffering. We see the fractured relationship with creation in our abuse of the earth's resources, with the pumping into the atmosphere of greenhouse gases, with the spillage of sewage into our rivers, and microplastics into the oceans. Just as now, at the time of Noah, the world was in chaos. He was the only human who was still faithful and obedient to God, and God needed to mend the fractured world. So he sent a flood of epic proportions, and this was a message of judgment on a disobedient and faithless world. But his message was not just about judgment. It was also about salvation, about mending a broken world. This time of year we celebrate harvest, and I wonder what has this got to do with harvest? God's act of salvation is to bring Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons and their wives out of the ark, along with a pair of every living creature, so that all can multiply and be fruitful. God's act of salvation is relational. We are to care for the world that God has saved. We are once again given stewardship of a land and all the creatures that live amongst us. he gives us a second chance, and we are to be responsible for the care of his creation. God promises Noah that he will never again curse the ground because of humans, even though we mess up time and time again. He promises that the seasons will continue unrelenting. He promises that there will always be seeds to sow and fruit to harvest. He promises that there will always be sun and rain, day and night. There will always be conditions for healthy and fruitful life. So what are our responsibilities in response to God's covenant promise to Noah? Let's go back to the beginning of the book of Genesis. God's curse on Adam was that he would have to work hard on the land for it to be fruitful. At harvest time, we give thanks for our farm workers, for our food distributors, for our shopkeepers. We too have our part to play in supporting the farming industry, particularly in areas of the world where there is inequality between the money given to the growers and producers of food and the price the supermarkets charge us for the goods. Organisations like Fair Trade seek to work for equitable remuneration. And when we think of the working conditions that some have to endure, we can seek fair working practices for all, as well as decent wages, in our attempts to lift the curse laid on Adam. Eve was cursed with the pain of childbirth and with being dominated by man. With advances in medicine, that pain can be diminished, but never really goes away. It still has to be endured. Society today still sees broken relationships where one side dominates another. We thank God for the wonder of new life and pray for families where relationships are broken. We thank God for those who choose to care for children, whether their own children or by fostering or adoption. As we've travelled rapidly through the first chapters of Genesis, we acknowledge that we have all sinned, that we have all failed to care for God's wonderful creation. We thank God that his judgment on the world was completed by an act of salvation, so that the world could once again be fruitful and multiply. We of course remember that as Noah offered burnt sacrifice to God in thanksgiving for his salvation, we also remember that it is through the sacrifice of God's only Son, Jesus, that we receive our salvation. And so we bring our harvest thanks to God for his provision, for his covenant promise made to Noah, and for his faithfulness through seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night.